University. I'm honored to be here. Today there's a lot of discussion about communication, and I think this talk also fits with that topic and that general theme, namely communication between different scientific disciplines, different disciplinary approaches. Because to be honest, I'm a relatively newcomer to the field of psychedelic science. I got actually only interested in psychedelic science about 5 years ago during my sabbatical at Stanford University. I was doing research on religion and spirituality, and there I met a group of people who had a strong interest in psychedelic research and said, like, hey, look what's going on there. This might be of interest to you as well. So the theme of today's conference is Synergies and Crossroads. And similar to Kim this morning, I'd been thinking, what can I share with you to provide a new and fresh perspective on psychedelic research? Because, also as Kim said, it is like preaching to the choir. You know all this stuff, the rebus model, the entropic brain hypothesis, clinical applications. So what is a kind of new perspective that I can provide? But also, I get a lot of requests from students who are interested in pursuing a career in psychedelic research. And I actually thought it might be interesting to share a bit of my personal story, my personal academic career and development, to see what lessons can be learned and to give you advice maybe on how you could pursue your interests in this field. So basically what I hope to do in the next half hour is to show you what lessons can be learned for psychedelic science from other disciplines, methods, and different scientific perspectives. And I'll come back to this question at the end of the presentation. To start off, this is me, approximately 15 years ago, when I was doing my internship at the Donders Institute for Brain and Cognition in Nijmegen. I was doing basic research on action and perception. I was instructing people to grasp objects, to point towards objects, and we were using EEG to study how the brain transforms a motor plan in a visual representation. So if you have to grasp an object, the orientation is relevant for grasping it. If you only have to point towards it, the orientation is not relevant. And we looked at the early visual processing in the brain. So this was part of my PhD project, but I was also doing fun research with infants. So at the time there was a lot of discussion on the mirror neuron system that resonates with observed actions, but we didn't know really if children and young infants had a similar system in place. So we set up an EEG study, several EEG studies, to figure out how young infants responded to observed movements on the screen. And that's what we did, and we found a correlate of presumed mirror neuron activation in young infants. But that seems a long stretch and far away from what was just introduced as the PRISM Lab, where we study psychedelic, religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences. So what happened in between? Today I'm going to provide you a brief overview of the kind of trajectory and the lessons learned along the way, and I'll end with some recommendations and insights for psychedelic science in general. So I hope to answer the question, what happened in between and what actually triggered my interest in these topics. So my personal interest goes back to the personal experiences I had growing up in a Pentecostal church close to Amsterdam. I was a teenager and I was witnessing miraculous events, altered states of consciousness, such as exorcism, people being prayed for and demons being cast out. Faith healing, people would come to the front of the audience, they were being prayed for and they would heal miraculously. Speaking in tongues, many people in the church would speak in a different language that they didn't understand themselves, and it was a kind of divine communication with God. And being slain in the spirit. So people would come to the front, they were being prayed for, they would fall down and have a very ecstatic and intense experience of meeting God. And they would lay there often for hours and hours and often describe that as one of the most intense experiences of their lives. I was raised in that church. I was a Pentecostal religious believer myself, and at the time I was already thinking, what is going on here? Is this God actually revealing himself? Is it maybe the devil? Is it the Antichrist that's trying to cause confusion? Or could it be that there's a psychological explanation to these events that we witness? Are people just imitating each other? How can it be that some people are more prone to having these very ecstatic experiences than others? And how can it be that every week you see the same people coming forward who always have these experiences? And some people desperately longing to have these experiences, but they never fall down on the floor. So that basically sparked my interests. So I started out studying psychology and philosophy to find out more about what science had to teach us about the human mind. I did my PhD, as I said, in cognitive neuroscience, but still lingering in the back of my mind, I had this deep interest in altered states of consciousness. So when I got the opportunity to choose a postdoctoral research project, I was actually intrigued by the work of Olaf Blanke, who is a neurologist in Geneva, and he was one of the first people who showed that you can trigger out-of-body experiences by stimulating the brain of intracranial epilepsy patients. So by applying a small current, he basically showed that you can repeatedly induce this experience where a person literally leaves the body, sees him or herself from an outside perspective, and has a different view on the self. And also these experiences can be manipulated in the lab by using virtual reality. And we use those type of technologies to fool the brain into thinking that you have a different perspective on yourself than you actually have. We also worked, for instance, with a rotating chair in which you could move people around. That also is basically a direct way to activate the vestibular system. We asked people to imagine themselves in different perspectives, so in a first-person perspective or in a third-person perspective, and we basically showed that these processes interact. So if you mess up the vestibular system, then this basically helps you to take the perspective of an outsider, of a third-person perspective. So this already brought me a bit closer to the interest that I had in altered states, and basically showing that through multisensory integration you can get insight in how these altered states come about. But then after the end of my postdoc, I thought what I'm really interested in is why do so many people believe in the kind of things that I grew up with, supernatural phenomena, believe in devils, believe in angels, beliefs in gods. How do these beliefs originate? So I looked into the literature and I came across the so-called cognitive science of religion, which is basically adopting an evolutionary perspective of why religion emerged in the first place. And one of the predominant theoretical frameworks that had been put forward in the literature was the notion of the hyperactive agency detection device. And this was so-called byproduct theory of religion. And basically the hyperactive agency detection device postulates that we have an innate, a deeply ingrained tendency to infer agents around us. Because from an evolutionary point of view, it's always better to be safe than sorry. So if we are uncertain, then our brain infers there's an agent out there, a predator, another human. So whenever you hear something, a sound in the hallway, someone moving in the distance, you infer it must be someone else. And this is adaptive, based on this simple principle. But as a relatively innocent byproduct, according to this theory, people started to have false positive agent experiences. And the theory basically says that these false positive experiences, hey, there's someone else out there, are at the basis of supernatural beliefs in, for instance, ancestor spirits, demons, ghosts, etc. So I thought this was an interesting theoretical idea, but at the time I could not find a whole lot of empirical research actually scrutinizing and validating this idea. So we first set out to do individual difference studies. So we recruited a large variety of different people, including people believing in psychic phenomena. So we went out to psychic fairs where people have psychic readings, etc. We gave them a psychic belief questionnaire, and we also gave them agency detection tasks. Think, for instance, about a task in which they have to detect faces in white noise. And we found across a couple of different studies that the more strongly people believe in supernatural phenomena and psychic phenomena, the more they have a bias for falsely inferring that there's an agent. So there's a correlation. But as everyone knows, correlation is not causation. So in order to really validate this idea that there's a causal relation between agent detection and supernatural beliefs, you need experimental evidence. So we set up a couple of experimental studies to test this premise. First off, that if you threaten people, if people get scared, that they have an increased bias to perceive more agents. We did this in a lab-based approach by presenting people trial by trial with threatening stimuli and agent detection tasks, such as, for instance, a biological motion detection task in which people have detected in the pattern of dots, is there an agent or is there not an agent present, with a face perception task, but also with white noise. So they had to detect if they could hear a human voice. With different manipulations, so threatening pictures, threatening music, using virtual reality manipulations. But basically, in none of these studies, we found any effect of threat on agency detection. But that could very well be to the fact that all these manipulations were simply too weak and they lacked in ecological validity. So in order to increase the ecological validity, we actually came up with the idea to really tailor a virtual reality environment to measure agent detection. So we developed a pleasant virtual reality environment and a threatening virtual reality environment. And we included agency cues. So for instance, the whistling of the leaves, or the rustling of the leaves, or something that would move by in the distance. And we asked participants to press a button whenever they thought there was a human agent present in the virtual reality scenario. And as you can see, in a threatening forest, participants more often press the button than in the non-threatening forest. So that is indeed in line with the theory of hyperactive agency detection. If people feel threatened, they perceive danger, they perceive other agents. But now, the relation with supernatural beliefs. At the time, so I transitioned basically from the field of cognitive neuroscience to more social psychology. I was employed at the University of Amsterdam, and one frequently used technique to gain insight in supernatural beliefs is called religious priming, where you basically prime people with religious concepts. So, for instance, subliminally, you present words like God, demon, devil on the screen, and a whole range of studies had shown that if you do this, that you get all types of effects, for instance, on pro-social behavior. That if you prime people with God, they give more money because they feel as if they're being watched. So I thought this was an interesting technique to be used to see if you prime people with religious agents, if they detect more or agents also in these perceptual decision-making tasks. However, in none of these studies we ever found evidence for an effect of religious priming on agent detection. We did find an effect of human priming. So if you prime people, not surprisingly, with a human agent, they detect more faces, they detect more moving bodies in the dots, etc. So the paradigm basically worked, but it didn't pick up on supernatural priming. So another frequently used method to induce supernatural experiences and beliefs in the literature is so-called control threat priming. So in social psychology, people are being primed, for instance, by having them think back of a story in which they lacked control. So think back of a situation in which you were lacking control and you feel threatened. And several studies had shown that if you do this, that people perceive more illusory patterns, that they believe more strongly in a controlling God, and that people become more religious because they lack control, therefore they look for alternative sources of control. So we basically set up again a whole series of different experimental studies using this control threat manipulation with a conceptual replication in the paper above, but also with a direct replication of the original study. But none of these paradigms actually worked. I had never seen so many null results in my life, like a whole series of studies that failed, basically, which made me kind of depressed. Because at that time, there were meta-analyses coming out actually showing that religious priming is very effective. If you put all the studies together, there's strong evidence that religious priming has an effect on whatever measure you could think of, which made me actually look critically at that meta-analysis. And together with a couple of statisticians, we reanalyzed the data from that meta-analysis. And we found basically that depending on the meta-analytic technique that you choose, you can either prove there's very strong evidence for religious priming, or you can prove that there's complete absence for religious priming. With the same data, but different meta-analytic tools yield different outcomes. So that is actually quite shocking, because meta-analyses are often perceived to be the gold standard in synthesizing results for instance, randomized controlled clinical trials. So if we cannot trust these techniques, what is a remedy? And I think a remedy is pre-registration and doing registered reports where you specify in advance, this is how we're going to set up the study, this is how we're going to analyze the data, and then you stick with that analysis plan. And then you have confirmatory tests of your effects. So this basically actually provided the basis of the so-called religious replication project, which was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. So basically, based on all these field replications, we set out to scrutinize the literature to see what type of effects could be replicated and what might be the cross-cultural generalizability of different effects. So we looked at different effects, including neuroscience of religion and mystical experiences, mentalizing, religion and health, dualism, and source credibility effects. And I will go over a couple of them right now. So first off, the neuroscience of religiosity and mystical experiences. So if you look at the literature, there are many studies with relatively small sample sizes, say between 20 and 30 participants, that had indicated that people who had more mystical experiences had specific changes in their brain. They had, for instance, a smaller hippocampal area. So we set out to replicate this finding with a larger sample size, so 211 participants, in a confirmatory way. So we specified our regions of interest a priori. We basically found no effect whatsoever of religious belief and no effect whatsoever of mystical experiences on gray matter volume. So reported associations between individual differences and gray matter volume could not be replicated. So that was actually quite shocking as well. Another frequently reported finding concerned the relation between mentalizing and religiosity. So it had been suggested that people who are autistic, who have problems with mentalizing, that they are less religious. Because if you want to believe in someone like God, you need to be able to perceive that there's a person that's watching you, that knows your mind. And if you have problems with mentalizing, it's more difficult to believe in such a person. So we set out to replicate this finding as well, with more than 70,000 participants, and also including autistic and non-autistic participants. We found the expected effect size, but it was close to 0.001 of the explained variance in whether people were religious or not was predicted by being autistic or not, or scoring high on the autism spectrum quotient. So also this put previous higher estimates of the effect size in perspective. But there's also more positive news, because some of the findings actually appear quite robust. So in the literature, especially in the American literature, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of discussion about the relation between being religious and mental health. So in these review papers basically indicate that people who are more religious, who have more religious experiences, who go to church more often, who have more spiritual experiences, overall thrive better. So that fits really well also with the insights from psychedelic science. So people who have these experiences have better physical and mental health. However, most of these studies showing that religion is good for your health originate from the US, not very surprisingly, showing these positive effects, because the US is a highly religious country. And therefore, if you're religious there, you adhere to the social norms, and that is adaptive. But for instance, in a country like the Netherlands, where the majority of the people are agnostic or atheist, being religious goes against the mainstream and might actually be maladaptive. So we basically set out to scrutinize if this relationship is dependent on the country level of religiosity. So first off, can we replicate that religion predicts mental and physical health? Second, can we show that this effect differs between countries and is actually reduced or even reversed in less religious countries? And because this is a rather controversial topic, we set up to do it as a many analyst approach, where we basically outsourced the data analysis to 120 different analysis teams. Because you could argue that there might be different ways of showing this effect. You could do a regression analysis, a simple correlation, you could set up a multi-level model, and people tend to disagree about the right method for analyzing this. So with a many analyst approach, you remedy this problem by basically taking into account all this variability and then seeing to what extent the outcomes of all the different analysis teams converge on the same finding. And in this case, they did quite well. So irrespective of how the different analysis teams rejected outliers, or how they set up the analysis, or what their statistical threshold was. Basically, all the teams, as is represented in the graph above, found positive evidence that indeed being religious is associated with stronger physical and mental health. Regarding the second research question, does this effect differ between different countries? Also, the majority of the teams found positive evidence for this interaction effect. So there is an effect of social norms on the religion-health relationship. But you can also see that there it is already a bit more variable. So some teams found not evidence for this hypothesis. But at least this provides quite a robust way to assess, okay, this is a relationship that we can have quite some trust in, irrespective of how the data is analyzed. As one final example of the many analysts, or of the cross-cultural project, the replication project, we wanted to investigate to what extent the tendency of people to reason dualistically is also cross-culturally prevalent. So people have an ingrained tendency to think about mental and physical states as being separate. So out-of-body experiences are often taken to be the ultimate proof of that. But also, if you ask young children, many children seem to be inclined to think that if a person dies, that the mental states continue to exist, so that the person is still able to be hungry, or sorry, not to be hungry, to be sad, or to be able to miss the loved ones, etc. And in the literature there is a debate, is this really deeply ingrained, or is this also related to cultural scaffolding, because children grow up with all these stories about mental states, etc. So we set out to determine the cross-cultural generalizability of mind-body dualism. And we did this simply by giving people a vignette. So people read a story about a grandmother passing away, and they had to answer questions. Suppose that the grandmother is dead now, do you think she can still be hungry? Do you think she can still sleep? Do you think she can still be sad? Do you think she can still be angry? So we asked basically about physical properties and mental properties. And people had to indicate, yes, this is possible, no, this is not possible, as a way to assess mind-body dualism. So what we find across the different countries that you can see here in the graph is that across basically all cultures, there's a tendency to reason dualistically, which is basically the difference between the red lines and the green bluish lines. So people across all the different cultures indicated that mental states continue to exist after a person dies, but physical states cease to exist. You can also see that this effect obviously is stronger for religious participants. So within each graph, on the left side are atheist participants, on the right side are religious participants. But you can also see that even atheist participants have this tendency to dissociate the mind from the body. And this pattern is also cross-culturally universal. So this is one of those findings that actually appears to have some stability in terms of cross-cultural prevalence. So that gave us a more promising outlook on the replicability. So some findings do not replicate, but there's also a hope some findings do actually replicate, although sometimes the effect sizes are small. However, going back to my interest, so I started out with these altered states of consciousness. And of course, this is all interesting and it provides some insights in the relationship between supernatural beliefs and different mechanisms and cognitive biases. But a recurring challenge is, how can you study these experiences, these altered states of consciousness in the lab in an ecologically valid way? And three methods that we have been using are placebo-brain stimulation, feelings of awe as a proxy for these experiences, and obviously psychedelics, because with psychedelics you directly have a controlled way to induce altered states of consciousness. But you don't even need psychedelics, because across a couple of studies we have shown that also through suggestion you can induce these experiences and you can induce altered states of consciousness. And this is very much based on the work of Michael Persinger, a neurologist who had developed the God helmet. He claimed that through stimulation of the temporal lobes you could induce mystical experiences. We basically set up our own God helmet studies, but we used a sham God helmet, a God helmet that never actually stimulated participants' brain. But we had this cover story that it would actually be doing so. It would be a brain stimulation manipulation. People were blindfolded, presented with white noise, under different experimental conditions, including between subjects designs, within subjects designs, and an individual difference approach. We found that people with a placebo God helmet, approximately 50% of them had mystical type experiences, ranging in intensity from mild tingling sensations, changes in body perception, feelings of floating, to more strong visual and auditory hallucinations, to complete out-of-body experiences and spiritual encounters. So this is showing basically also the power of placebo, that through placebo manipulations you can actually induce also mystical type experiences. We did the same with psychedelics. So we gave people a pill and we told them this is a microdose, and in another condition we gave them a pill and we told them this is a placebo. And also under these conditions, the effects were not very strong, but they were consistent. It turned out that people had mild psychedelic experiences if they believed they were microdosing compared to when they believed they got a placebo. So through suggestibility you can induce also psychedelic-like effects. So this is using placebo manipulations as a tool to assess altered states of consciousness, but there are other methods as well. So there's a rich literature on the effects of awe. So awe is characterized as a self-transcendent emotion. Key characteristics are need for accommodation and perceived vastness. It's typically elicited in response to perceptually vast stimuli. So for instance, this church might induce a feeling of awe. Or if you go out on the mountains, you see beautiful scenery, it induces a feeling of awe. And there are a lot of parallels between psychedelic experiences and awe experiences. For instance, people, when feeling an awe, also report they're less focused on the self. They feel small and insignificant, and they underestimate the size of their body, for instance. In an fMRI study, we looked at the neural correlates of what happens when people are feeling in awe. And we basically found that if people are in awe compared to when they are watching, for instance, positive videos or neutral videos, which are represented here in the second and third bar of each graph, but when people are watching awe videos, the default mode network was less activated than when people were watching these other videos. And that also fits well with this idea that if people are experiencing awe, that they are completely absorbed in what they see, and they have less mental and cognitive resources left for self-reflection and rumination. So that is the second way of looking at altered states in the lab. A third way, of course, is by using psychedelics. And we've only recently started this line. So we did a couple of studies on microdosing. We found, among other things, that microdosing seems to increase feelings of awe. However, a recurring problem that we encountered in these studies is that most of the effects are explained by breaking blind. So people break blind to their condition, and if you factor that in, if you factor, for instance, in the expectations that they have, or if you look separately at the people who broke blind versus the people who didn't break blind, the effects disappear. So also there, placebo and expectancy effects appear to play a role. But across all these different studies, one pattern that emerged again and again is that some people always had stronger experiences than others. And that was basically, those were the people who scored high on a personality trait that is called absorption. And you can measure this using the Telegram absorption scale. Example items of this scale are, for instance, I can be greatly moved by eloquent or poetic language. Sometimes I can change noise into music by the way I listen to it. If I wish, I can imagine that my body is so heavy that I could not move it, even if I wanted to. And across all these different studies, we found that in the microdosing studies, it predicts intensity of the experiences. Together with Tanya Lerman, with whom I worked at Stanford, she has shown that voice-hearing experiences in Pentecostal Christians, like the kind of religious people that I grew up with, are also predicted by absorption. Feelings of awe and wonder, with all these studies on awe, are also predicted by absorption. Mystical experiences with a placebo God helmet. Across all these different studies, absorption always predicts responsiveness to the God helmet manipulation. But also paranormal beliefs and encounters. People scoring high on absorption also more frequently have paranormal experiences. And key mechanisms underlying absorption seems to be mental imagery, vividness of mental imagery, and in relation to that, reality monitoring. Basically, people with a very vivid mental imagery more easily conflate imagined events with real events, and therefore imagined events come to be perceived to be as real experiences. And it relates strongly to openness to experiences. Well, that basically brings me towards the end of my academic pathway so far. So what type of lessons have we learned? The question that I started out with. What lessons can we learn for psychedelic science from all these different research fields? Psychology of religion and spirituality, evolutionary psychology, research on awe and wonder, the placebo God helmet studies, open science and replication approaches. So I think some of these insights resonate really well with what has already been discussed also in the discussion panel. So I think everyone agrees that we need more replication, higher sample sizes, pre-registration, open science practices, team science, and potentially many analyst and multiverse approaches to actually establish if specific findings are robust against arbitrary decisions in the analysis pipeline. But also, and this is a topic that came up before as well, we need to take into account placebo effects that are difficult to control for in psychedelic science because people easily break blind. But there are remedies. Of course, you can manipulate expectations, or at least if you don't manipulate them, you can measure them. And you can maybe avoid the breaking blind problem by including active placebos in your research. I think there are also lessons to be learned from the measurement of experiences. Because in this research field of the psychology of religion and spirituality, there's a long tradition of more than 5 decades of scale development, of fine-grained instruments that can be used to measure a diversity of experiences. So I really envision that there should be more of a crosstalk between psychedelic science on the one hand and this rich research tradition on altered states and religion and spirituality on the other hand. And also, I think one of the lessons that I learned is to take phenomenology seriously. For instance, research with the God helmets. You can think about whatever objective measure to see if people really have an altered state. For instance, looking at the heart rate, looking at the EMG, looking at the EEG. But in the end, what is most telling are basically the stories that people tell about their experiences, the detailed, fine-grained insights that they gained through their experiences. So we always need to rely on introspection and subjective reports to make sense of the physiological data as well. And lastly, I also think that there are lessons to be learned from theory. So all these different research approaches and research fields, like the hyperactive agency detection idea, I think can be greatly tested by using psychedelics, such as DMT, which obviously trigger agent experiences. The role of dualism, Chris Timmermans has shown that people become more dualist after a psychedelic retreat. So that actually resonates nicely with this idea that we're all actually basically intuitive dualists. So can we merge those two approaches? Feelings of awe. It has been suggested that awe could be a putative mechanism underlying the efficacy of psychedelic therapy. But what actually is awe? How can you measure it? How can you manipulate it? What is a theoretical model that helps us to account for how the effects of awe come about? And the same applies for the other stuff, like the effects of suggestibility in the God helmet studies. Predictive processing as a generic tool to make sense of psychedelic experiences and absorption. And last but not least, I think we need also to keep an open eye for different methods to induce altered states of consciousness. So psychedelics is one pathway, but of course there are also different ways to induce these experiences, such as meditation, holotropic breathing or breath work, sensory deprivation, etc. And we need a more comparative approach to see actually how these experiences compare. So when I started out 15 years ago doing my basic research on perception action, I could never have imagined that I would be invited to speak at this conference on psychedelic research. And I think that also would translate into my advice to you if you're considering pursuing a career in psychedelic research. You never know where you end up. And I think the best advice that Kim already also gave this morning is stay close to your real interest, stay close to your heart. And maybe let go of trying to be strategic, networking opportunities, taking every internship possible that has a slight fit with psychedelic research. Because if you're really motivated, you will find your way in the end, I think. So keep the right balance between being strategic, but also letting go and just exploring what comes across your path. And also in general, I think keep the right balance, because academia is a really fun and great environment to work in, but it can also be rather competitive and stressful. And maintaining a healthy life-work balance is a challenge for all of us. And I hope that you can succeed in this, finding this balance already at an early stage. So thanks also to all the people who made this research possible, all the collaborations, including the recently recruited lab members, Josie Marshall, Xavier Funk and Hussein Koilu, who contribute to the VD project of replicating and extending psychedelic research. And thank you all for being here.